Question 1. The investigation demonstrates that a proposed infrastructure development project in rural Alabama, intended to boost local employment and economic activity, has raised concerns regarding its potential impact on protected migratory bird habitats, a matter addressed by international conservation treaties to which the United States is a signatory. Considering Alabama's role in implementing such development, which approach best balances the project's economic objectives with Alabama's international legal obligations concerning environmental protection? Option A. Argue that international conservation treaties are not directly enforceable within Alabama's domestic legal framework and therefore do not impose binding obligations on the project, prioritizing local economic development above all else. Option B. Proceed with the project as planned, focusing solely on maximizing immediate economic benefits for the local community, and address any potential environmental concerns only if formal complaints or legal challenges arise from international bodies. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that explicitly analyzes the project's potential effects on migratory bird populations and their habitats, and integrate findings into project design to ensure compliance with relevant international conservation treaties, seeking innovative solutions that minimize ecological disruption while achieving development goals. Option D. Lobby for amendments to the international conservation treaties to exclude development projects in Alabama from their purview, thereby removing any perceived obstacles to local economic growth. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that explicitly analyzes the project's potential effects on migratory bird populations and their habitats, and integrate findings into project design to ensure compliance with relevant international conservation treaties, seeking innovative solutions that minimize ecological disruption while achieving development goals. Explanation: the investigation demonstrates a common challenge in international development projects within Alabama, navigating the complex interplay between international legal norms and local development priorities, particularly when these appear to be in tension. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that development initiatives, while aiming to foster progress, do not inadvertently undermine or conflict with established international legal obligations or ethical standards that Alabama is bound to uphold. This requires careful judgment to balance competing interests and ensure compliance with both international commitments and the specific needs of the development context. The best approach involves a thorough assessment of how the proposed development project aligns with Alabama's obligations under relevant international agreements, such as those concerning environmental protection or human rights, and how these international standards can be integrated to enhance, rather than hinder, local development outcomes. This approach prioritizes a proactive understanding of international legal frameworks and their practical application in development projects. It recognizes that international law, when properly understood and applied, can provide a robust foundation for sustainable and equitable development, offering best practices and standards that can elevate local initiatives. This aligns with the principle of ensuring that development activities are conducted in a manner consistent with Alabama's international responsibilities, fostering long-term benefits and avoiding potential legal or reputational repercussions. An approach that prioritizes immediate local economic gains without adequately considering the international legal implications is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for Alabama's international commitments, potentially leading to violations of international law and subsequent legal challenges or sanctions. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to dismiss international legal considerations as irrelevant to local development, assuming that domestic law or local expediency supersedes international obligations. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the binding nature of international law and the potential for its extraterritorial application or influence on domestic policy. Finally, an approach that seeks to circumvent international legal requirements through selective interpretation or by focusing solely on perceived loopholes ignores the spirit and intent of international law, which is to promote global cooperation and uphold fundamental principles, thereby risking ethical breaches and undermining the integrity of the development process. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive review of applicable international legal instruments and principles relevant to the specific development sector and geographic area. This should be followed by a detailed analysis of how these international standards intersect with local development goals and existing Alabama legal frameworks. Engaging with stakeholders, including international legal experts and local community representatives, is crucial to identify potential conflicts and collaboratively develop solutions that are both legally compliant and contextually appropriate. The ultimate goal is to foster development that is not only economically beneficial, but also ethically sound and legally defensible on the international stage. Question 2. Analysis of a proposed international development project in Alabama that involves significant land use changes impacting areas traditionally inhabited by indigenous tribes. What is the most ethically and legally sound approach for the project developers to take regarding the rights of these indigenous communities? Option A. Rely on existing state and federal environmental regulations to guide the project, assuming that compliance with these regulations adequately addresses the concerns of indigenous communities. Option B. Proceed with the project as planned, focusing on environmental impact assessments and offering financial compensation to affected communities after project commencement to mitigate any unforeseen negative consequences. Option C. Conduct comprehensive human rights impact assessments that specifically address indigenous rights. Engage in meaningful consultation with tribal leadership and community members to obtain free, prior, and informed consent (FPIC) regarding project plans, and integrate community feedback into project design and implementation. Option D. Initiate project development immediately to secure economic benefits and address any potential human rights concerns raised by indigenous groups on a case-by-case basis as they arise. The correct answer is C. Conduct comprehensive human rights impact assessments that specifically address indigenous rights. Engage in meaningful consultation with tribal leadership and community members to obtain free, prior, and informed consent (FPIC) regarding project plans, and integrate community feedback into project design and implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a development project's economic objectives and the potential impact on indigenous communities' human rights, specifically their right to self-determination and cultural preservation. Navigating this requires a delicate balance, informed by international human rights law principles and the specific legal and cultural context of Alabama. Careful judgment is needed to ensure that development proceeds ethically and sustainably, respecting the rights of all stakeholders. The best approach involves proactively engaging with the indigenous communities to understand their concerns and incorporate their perspectives into the project's design and implementation. This means conducting thorough human rights impact assessments that specifically consider the rights of indigenous peoples, as recognized under international law and potentially reflected in Alabama's specific legal framework concerning tribal lands and resources. This approach prioritizes the principle of free, prior, and informed consent (FPIC), a cornerstone of indigenous rights, ensuring that communities have a meaningful say in decisions affecting them. It aligns with the ethical imperative to avoid harm and promote the well-being of vulnerable populations, fostering a collaborative and rights-respecting development process. An approach that prioritizes immediate project commencement without adequate consultation fails to acknowledge the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples to participate in decisions affecting their lands and livelihoods. This disregards the principles of FPIC and can lead to significant human rights violations, including cultural disruption and dispossession, which are legally and ethically unacceptable. Another unacceptable approach is to rely solely on existing environmental impact assessments without specifically addressing the human rights dimensions for indigenous communities. While environmental concerns are important, they do not fully encompass the broader spectrum of human rights, such as cultural integrity, spiritual connection to land, and the right to self-determination. This oversight can result in development that, while environmentally compliant, still infringes upon the distinct rights of indigenous groups. Finally, an approach that offers compensation as a primary solution without genuine engagement or consent is insufficient. While compensation may be a component of addressing impacts, it cannot replace the right to participate in decision-making or adequately remedy violations of cultural rights and self-determination. This approach treats rights as commodities rather than fundamental entitlements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders, particularly vulnerable groups like indigenous communities. This is followed by a comprehensive understanding of applicable international human rights standards and any specific state or tribal laws that protect indigenous rights in Alabama. The process should then involve meaningful consultation and engagement, prioritizing the principles of FPIC. Risk assessment should include human rights impacts, and mitigation strategies must be developed collaboratively with affected communities. Continuous monitoring and evaluation are crucial to ensure ongoing respect for human rights throughout the project lifecycle. Question 3. Consider a scenario where an Alabama-based organization is planning a large-scale agricultural development project in a Latin American country that is a signatory to the American Convention on Human Rights. The project aims to boost local economies through increased crop production and export. However, preliminary environmental impact studies suggest potential risks to local water sources, which are vital for the subsistence of indigenous communities. What is the most professionally responsible approach for the Alabama organization to take regarding the potential impact of its development project on the human rights of the affected indigenous communities, considering the obligations under the Inter-American Human Rights System? Option A. Focus exclusively on maximizing the project's economic returns, viewing human rights considerations as secondary to the primary development objective, and only engage with communities if legally compelled to do so by the host country's courts. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment, engage in meaningful consultation with the affected indigenous communities and relevant human rights experts, and develop robust mitigation measures to address identified risks to water resources and other potential human rights concerns before commencing significant project activities. Option C. Rely solely on the host country's environmental regulations, assuming they are sufficient to protect the rights of the indigenous communities, and proceed with the project without further human rights-specific due diligence. Option D. Proceed with the project as planned, assuming that the economic benefits will ultimately outweigh any potential environmental or social disruptions, and address any complaints that may arise after the project is underway. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment, engage in meaningful consultation with the affected indigenous communities and relevant human rights experts, and develop robust mitigation measures to address identified risks to water resources and other potential human rights concerns before commencing significant project activities. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the economic development goals of an Alabama-based international development project with the human rights obligations recognized under regional human rights systems, specifically the Inter-American Human Rights System, which is relevant to many Latin American countries where such projects might operate. The tension arises when development activities, even if intended to improve livelihoods, could potentially infringe upon established human rights, such as the right to adequate housing or the right to a healthy environment, as interpreted by bodies like the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Navigating these competing interests requires a nuanced understanding of both development imperatives and human rights law, demanding careful judgment to avoid legal liability and ethical breaches. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively integrating human rights impact assessment into the project's planning and implementation phases. This means conducting thorough due diligence to identify potential human rights risks associated with proposed development activities, consulting with affected communities and relevant human rights stakeholders, and developing mitigation strategies to prevent or minimize any adverse human rights impacts. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principle of due diligence required by international human rights law and the operational guidelines of many development finance institutions. Specifically, it reflects the responsibility of states, and by extension, entities acting on their behalf or in their interest, to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. By anticipating and addressing potential human rights issues early, the project can avoid violations and ensure its development objectives are achieved in a rights-respecting manner, thereby complying with the spirit and letter of regional human rights instruments and their jurisprudence. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that prioritizes immediate economic gains without adequately considering potential human rights consequences is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the fundamental principle that development should not come at the expense of human rights. Such an approach risks violating the rights of affected populations, leading to legal challenges, reputational damage, and ultimately undermining the long-term sustainability and legitimacy of the development project. It neglects the duty to prevent harm, a core tenet of human rights obligations. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to rely solely on the host country's domestic legal framework without considering regional human rights standards. While domestic law is important, regional human rights systems often set higher standards and provide stronger protections. Ignoring these regional obligations, particularly when they are binding on the host country, can lead to non-compliance with international commitments and expose the project to criticism and potential sanctions from regional human rights bodies. This approach fails to acknowledge the extraterritorial reach of certain human rights obligations and the influence of regional jurisprudence on national legal interpretations. Finally, an approach that assumes development inherently benefits human rights without empirical verification is flawed. While the intention may be positive, development projects can have unintended negative consequences. Failing to conduct specific assessments to understand and address these potential impacts, even if seemingly minor, is a failure of due diligence. This can lead to situations where development activities inadvertently contribute to human rights violations, such as displacement or environmental degradation, which are often addressed by regional human rights courts. Professional reasoning. Professionals involved in international development projects must adopt a proactive and rights-based approach. This involves a continuous process of risk identification, assessment, and mitigation concerning human rights. A decision-making framework should prioritize understanding the specific regional human rights context of the project's location, engaging meaningfully with all stakeholders, particularly vulnerable groups, and embedding human rights considerations into every stage of the project lifecycle, from conception to evaluation. This ensures that development efforts are not only economically viable, but also ethically sound and legally compliant with international and regional human rights obligations. Question 4. During the evaluation of a foreign company's proposal to establish a significant trade presence within Alabama, which approach best ensures compliance with Alabama's principles of international trade law while fostering beneficial economic engagement? Option A. Implement Alabama's trade regulations strictly and without modification, expecting the foreign company to adapt entirely to the state's existing framework, regardless of their operational model. Option B. Assume the foreign company's existing international trade practices are sufficient and will automatically align with Alabama's legal requirements, proceeding with minimal state-specific review. Option C. Prioritize general international trade law principles without a detailed examination of how these principles are specifically enacted and enforced within Alabama's state statutes and administrative rules. Option D. Conduct comprehensive due diligence on the foreign entity's business model and propose trade activities, followed by consultation with Alabama legal counsel and relevant state agencies to align their operations with Alabama's specific regulatory framework and international trade principles. The correct answer is D. Conduct comprehensive due diligence on the foreign entity's business model and propose trade activities, followed by consultation with Alabama legal counsel and relevant state agencies to align their operations with Alabama's specific regulatory framework and international trade principles. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of international trade law, particularly concerning the application of Alabama's specific regulatory framework to a foreign entity seeking to engage in trade. The challenge lies in balancing the economic opportunities presented by foreign investment with the need to ensure compliance with Alabama's laws and principles of international trade, which can involve differing interpretations and enforcement mechanisms. Careful judgment is required to navigate these potential conflicts and ensure a mutually beneficial and legally sound outcome. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking to understand and integrate the foreign entity's operational model and objectives within the existing Alabama regulatory landscape for international trade. This approach prioritizes thorough due diligence, including a detailed review of the foreign entity's business plan, proposed trade activities, and any existing international agreements or practices they adhere to. It then involves consulting with legal counsel specializing in Alabama, international trade law and relevant state agencies to identify potential areas of conflict, opportunities for compliance, and any necessary modifications to their business model or Alabama's approach to facilitate trade. This ensures that all actions are grounded in a comprehensive understanding of Alabama's specific legal requirements and the principles of international trade law as they apply within the state, thereby minimizing legal risks and fostering sustainable trade relations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the foreign entity's existing international practices are automatically compliant with Alabama's laws and principles of international trade. This overlooks the fact that Alabama has its own specific regulatory framework and enforcement mechanisms that may differ significantly from those in other jurisdictions or international norms. This failure to conduct specific due diligence for Alabama can lead to violations of state law, potential penalties, and damage to Alabama's reputation as a reliable trading partner. Another incorrect approach is to impose Alabama's regulations rigidly without considering the foreign entity's operational realities or the broader principles of international trade law that encourage reciprocal trade. This can stifle foreign investment and trade by creating unnecessary barriers and demonstrating a lack of flexibility or understanding of international business practices. Such an approach risks alienating potential trading partners and missing out on economic benefits for Alabama. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on general principles of international trade law, without adequately investigating how these principles are interpreted and implemented within Alabama's specific legal context. While international principles provide a foundation, their practical application is often shaped by state-level legislation, administrative rules, and judicial precedent. Ignoring this specific state-level application can lead to misinterpretations and noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a scenario should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, they must clearly define the scope of the engagement and the specific international trade activities being considered. Second, they should conduct thorough research into both the foreign entity's proposed operations and Alabama's relevant laws and regulations governing international trade. Third, they must identify potential areas of divergence and seek expert legal and regulatory advice to bridge these gaps. Fourth, they should engage in open communication with the foreign entity to explain Alabama's requirements and explore mutually agreeable solutions. Finally, they must ensure that all proposed actions are documented and demonstrably compliant with Alabama's legal framework and the overarching principles of international trade law. Question 5. Research into potential new trade agreements between Alabama and several developing nations in Southeast Asia has identified a proposal to significantly reduce tariffs on agricultural imports from these nations into Alabama. However, concerns have been raised by some stakeholders regarding the potential impact of such an agreement on the regulatory capacity and existing agricultural support programs within these developing countries. Considering the principles of international trade law and ethical development, what is the most appropriate course of action for Alabama's trade representatives? Option A. Focus solely on the potential for increased export opportunities for Alabama's agricultural products to these Southeast Asian nations, and frame the tariff reduction as a reciprocal measure without detailed examination of the developing nation's internal economic and legal vulnerabilities. Option B. Proceed with the tariff reduction proposal immediately, emphasizing the economic benefits for Alabama's consumers and businesses, and assume that the developing nations will adapt their internal policies as necessary to accommodate the new trade terms. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment that analyzes the potential effects of tariff reductions on the agricultural sectors of the developing nations, including their ability to maintain existing support programs and regulatory frameworks, and engage in consultations with these nations to ensure the agreement aligns with their developmental priorities and legal capacities. Option D. Advocate for the inclusion of stringent intellectual property rights protections within the trade agreement that would benefit Alabama's technology sector, even if this places additional regulatory burdens on the developing nation's nascent industries. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment that analyzes the potential effects of tariff reductions on the agricultural sectors of the developing nations, including their ability to maintain existing support programs and regulatory frameworks, and engage in consultations with these nations to ensure the agreement aligns with their developmental priorities and legal capacities. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the complex interplay between international trade agreements and the specific developmental needs and legal frameworks of Alabama's trading partners. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that proposed trade initiatives, while aiming for economic growth, do not inadvertently create legal or ethical conflicts with existing international obligations or undermine the sovereignty and regulatory capacity of developing nations. Careful judgment is required to balance economic aspirations with legal compliance and ethical considerations. The best professional approach involves a thorough legal and economic impact assessment of the proposed trade agreement, specifically focusing on how its provisions align with existing international trade law principles and the developmental priorities of the partner countries. This includes analyzing potential impacts on local industries, labor standards, environmental regulations, and intellectual property rights within those developing nations. The justification for this approach rests on the fundamental principles of international law and ethical development practices, which emphasize mutual benefit, respect for national sovereignty, and the avoidance of exploitative or detrimental outcomes for less developed economies. Adherence to the World Trade Organization (WTO) agreements, which Alabama, as part of the United States, is bound by, necessitates that trade liberalization does not occur at the expense of sustainable development or the regulatory autonomy of partner states. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize immediate economic gains without adequately considering the long-term legal and developmental implications for the partner countries. This could manifest as advocating for provisions that disproportionately benefit Alabama's industries while imposing onerous obligations on developing nations, potentially leading to trade disputes or accusations of neocolonialism. Such an approach fails to uphold the spirit of fair trade and sustainable development enshrined in international agreements and ethical development principles. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to assume that all developing countries have the same legal and economic capacity to absorb the terms of a trade agreement. This overlooks the diversity of legal systems, institutional strengths, and developmental stages across different nations. Failing to tailor the agreement to the specific context of each partner country risks creating unmanageable burdens and undermining the intended benefits of the trade relationship. This violates the principle of differentiated treatment, often found in international development frameworks. A further flawed approach would be to disregard the potential for unintended consequences, such as the displacement of local businesses or the exacerbation of existing inequalities. In the pursuit of trade expansion, ethical development mandates a proactive consideration of social and economic impacts, ensuring that trade agreements contribute to inclusive growth rather than widening disparities. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-stakeholder consultation, including legal experts specializing in international trade law and development economics, as well as representatives from the developing countries themselves. A rigorous due diligence process, encompassing legal compliance checks against relevant international treaties and national laws of partner countries, alongside an assessment of developmental impact, is crucial. Professionals must adopt a framework that prioritizes fairness, sustainability, and mutual respect in all international trade engagements, ensuring that economic objectives are pursued in a manner that is both legally sound and ethically responsible. Question 6. Benchmark analysis indicates that an Alabama-based agricultural technology firm has developed a novel, genetically modified soybean variety with significantly enhanced drought resistance. The firm intends to commercialize this variety within Alabama and potentially export it to other countries. The firm's in-house legal team is considering filing a standard utility patent application to protect their innovation, but they are unsure if this is the most appropriate or comprehensive method given the international implications of their product. What is the most prudent course of action for the Alabama firm to ensure adequate protection for its novel soybean variety, considering the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, agreement? Option A. Rely on the inherent novelty and non-obviousness of the soybean variety to prevent unauthorized use, without pursuing formal intellectual property protection. Option B. Focus solely on domestic market protection through trade secrets, and avoid international patent filings to minimize complexity and potential disputes. Option C. Consult with legal counsel specializing in international intellectual property law and Alabama's specific patent and plant variety protection statutes to determine the most appropriate protection mechanism under TRIPS and U.S. law. Option D. Proceed with a standard utility patent application, assuming that novel plant varieties are automatically covered by general patent law without further specific considerations. The correct answer is C. Consult with legal counsel specializing in international intellectual property law and Alabama's specific patent and plant variety protection statutes to determine the most appropriate protection mechanism under TRIPS and U.S. law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between a domestic company's desire to protect its intellectual property and the international obligations Alabama businesses must adhere to under the TRIPS agreement, particularly concerning the protection of plant varieties. Navigating these competing interests requires a nuanced understanding of both national patent law and international trade law, demanding careful judgment to avoid legal repercussions and maintain ethical business practices. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves seeking legal counsel specializing in international intellectual property law and Alabama's specific patent and plant variety protection statutes. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the complexity of TRIPS obligations and the need for expert guidance to ensure compliance. Specifically, under the TRIPS agreement, member countries are obligated to provide protection for plant varieties, either through patents or a sui generis system, or a combination thereof. Alabama, as part of the United States, must implement these obligations. Consulting with legal experts ensures that the company's actions align with both U.S. federal law, which implements TRIPS, and any relevant state-level considerations, thereby safeguarding the company from potential infringement claims and ensuring it respects the intellectual property rights of others. Incorrect approach is analysis. Pursuing a domestic patent application without considering the specific requirements for plant variety protection under TRIPS would be an incorrect approach. This fails to acknowledge that TRIPS mandates specific protection mechanisms for plant varieties, which may differ from traditional patent criteria. Relying solely on general patent law without addressing the sui generis or patent-based protection for plant varieties stipulated by TRIPS could lead to inadequate protection or infringement of rights. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because the innovation is novel and non-obvious, it automatically qualifies for standard patent protection without investigating the specific provisions for plant varieties under TRIPS and U.S. law. This overlooks the distinct legal framework established for plant innovations. Finally, ignoring the potential for international protection and focusing only on domestic market exclusivity would be a flawed strategy. TRIPS is an international agreement, and understanding its implications is crucial for any business operating internationally or seeking to protect innovations that could have global relevance. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should first identify the core legal and ethical obligations at play. This involves recognizing the applicability of international agreements like TRIPS to domestic law. The next step is to assess the specific nature of the innovation in this case, a plant variety, and research the relevant legal frameworks for its protection. Seeking expert legal advice is paramount to ensure all regulatory requirements are met and to develop a strategy that is both legally sound and ethically responsible. This systematic approach minimizes risk and promotes fair competition. Question 7. The evaluation methodology shows that when designing trade facilitation and capacity building programs for developing nations in partnership with Alabama, what risk assessment approach best ensures sustainable and equitable development outcomes while adhering to ethical international development principles? Option A. A rapid implementation strategy driven by the urgency to demonstrate project success, with risk assessment conducted on a reactive basis as issues arise. Option B. A comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes identifying and mitigating potential negative impacts on the target developing nation's existing trade infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, and local economies, informed by thorough due diligence of the local context and institutional capacity. Option C. The implementation of standardized, globally recognized trade facilitation models, assuming their universal applicability and effectiveness across diverse developing economies. Option D. An approach that focuses primarily on the potential economic benefits for Alabama, assuming that any positive impact on the developing nation will be a secondary, albeit welcome, outcome. The correct answer is B. A comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes identifying and mitigating potential negative impacts on the target developing nation's existing trade infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, and local economies, informed by thorough due diligence of the local context and institutional capacity. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that assessing the effectiveness of trade facilitation and capacity building initiatives in developing nations within Alabama's international development context requires a nuanced approach. This scenario is professionally challenging because it demands balancing the economic development goals of Alabama with the specific needs and regulatory environments of developing countries, while also ensuring ethical and sustainable outcomes. Misjudgments can lead to ineffective aid, wasted resources, or even unintended negative consequences for the partner nations. The best approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes the identification and mitigation of potential negative impacts on the target developing nation's existing trade infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, and local economies. This includes a thorough due diligence process to understand the local context, potential for corruption, existing legal structures governing trade and investment, and the capacity of local institutions to absorb and manage new initiatives. Regulatory justification for this approach stems from the principles of responsible international development, which emphasize sustainability, local ownership, and adherence to international best practices in aid delivery. Ethically, it aligns with the duty to avoid harm and promote genuine development. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the potential economic benefits for Alabama, without adequately considering the recipient country's vulnerabilities. This overlooks the critical need to assess the recipient nation's capacity to integrate new trade facilitation measures without disrupting existing livelihoods or creating dependencies. Regulatory and ethical failures here include a potential violation of principles of equitable development and a disregard for the recipient nation's sovereignty and self-determination. Another incorrect approach is to implement standardized trade facilitation models without tailoring them to the specific socio-economic and legal realities of the developing nation. This fails to account for local customs, existing informal economies, and the unique challenges faced by small and medium-sized enterprises within that jurisdiction. The regulatory and ethical failures lie in imposing external solutions that may be ill-suited, unsustainable, and ultimately detrimental to local economic resilience. A further incorrect approach involves prioritizing speed of implementation over thorough risk analysis, driven by short-term political or economic pressures. This can lead to overlooking critical compliance issues, potential for illicit financial flows, or the exacerbation of existing inequalities. The regulatory and ethical failures are significant, as they can result in noncompliance with international anti-corruption standards and a breach of the duty of care owed to the developing nation. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the objectives of the trade facilitation and capacity-building initiative, followed by a multi-stakeholder consultation process within the developing nation. A robust risk assessment framework, incorporating economic, social, environmental, and governance factors, should then be applied. This framework should guide the design and implementation of interventions, with continuous monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to adapt to evolving circumstances and ensure accountability. Question 8. Quality control measures reveal that a proposed large-scale infrastructure development project in Alabama, funded in part by international development loans, may potentially impact indigenous tribal lands and traditional water sources. What is the most appropriate risk assessment approach to ensure compliance with international human rights standards, given the United States ratification of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? Option A. Undertake a general assessment of potential social and economic impacts, without a specific focus on the detailed provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Option B. Proceed with the project based on adherence to existing Alabama state environmental and land use regulations, assuming these adequately cover all necessary protections. Option C. Rely solely on the legal frameworks of the international development loan providers, assuming their due diligence processes will ensure human rights compliance. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment, specifically evaluating potential effects on rights protected under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including consultation with affected communities and development of mitigation strategies. Correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment, specifically evaluating potential effects on rights protected under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including consultation with affected communities and development of mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential conflict between a state-sponsored development project in Alabama and the obligations undertaken by the United States under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICPR. Specifically, the challenge lies in ensuring that the project's implementation does not infringe upon the rights guaranteed by the ICPR, which the U.S. has ratified. Careful judgment is required to balance economic development goals with fundamental human rights protections. The best professional approach involves conducting a comprehensive human rights impact assessment that specifically evaluates the project's potential effects on rights protected under the ICPR, such as the right to adequate housing, freedom from forced eviction, and the right to participate in cultural life. This assessment should identify potential risks, propose mitigation measures, and ensure that affected communities have meaningful opportunities for consultation and redress. This approach is correct because it proactively addresses potential violations of ICPR provisions, aligning with the U.S.'s international commitments and ethical obligations to uphold human rights. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible international development and adherence to the principles enshrined in the ICPR, which are relevant to the conduct of U.S. entities, even in domestic projects with international implications. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the development project without any specific consideration of the ICPR, relying solely on domestic environmental and land use regulations. This fails to acknowledge the binding nature of international human rights treaties and the potential for domestic actions to have extraterritorial implications or to violate rights that are also protected under international law. This approach risks violating the U.S.'s international obligations and could lead to legal challenges and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because the project is domestic, international human rights law is not applicable. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of how international law, once ratified, can inform and shape domestic policy and practice, particularly concerning fundamental rights. It ignores the spirit and intent of the ICPR, which aims to establish universal standards for the protection of civil and political rights. A further incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial review of potential human rights impacts, focusing only on widely recognized rights without delving into the specific protections offered by the ICPR, such as the right to privacy or freedom of movement, which might be indirectly affected by large-scale development. The superficiality risks overlooking subtle but significant infringements on protected rights, failing to meet the standard of due diligence required under international human rights principles. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a rights-based approach. This involves understanding the relevant international legal obligations, conducting thorough due diligence, engaging with affected stakeholders, and integrating human rights considerations into all stages of project planning and implementation. When faced with potential conflicts, the framework should guide towards prioritizing the protection of fundamental rights as guaranteed by the ICPR. Question 9. Strategic planning requires Alabama to assess the potential impact of a new international development project on local communities. Which risk assessment approach best aligns with the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and ensures responsible international investment? Option A. Prioritize immediate economic benefits and assume that existing Alabama state laws will adequately protect all relevant human rights. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment to identify potential risks and integrate mitigation strategies into the project's design and implementation. Option C. Focus solely on the project's financial viability and legal compliance under Alabama statutes, deferring any human rights concerns until they become apparent. Option D. Implement the project first and address any human rights issues that arise as they are reported by affected parties. Correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment to identify potential risks and integrate mitigation strategies into the project's design and implementation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the pursuit of economic development with fundamental human rights principles, particularly in the context of international investment. Alabama, as a state involved in international development initiatives, must ensure its actions align with both its domestic legal framework and universally recognized human rights standards. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDR, while not a legally binding treaty in itself, serves as a foundational document for international human rights law and influences the interpretation and application of treaties and domestic laws. A risk assessment approach is crucial to identify potential human rights impacts before they occur, allowing for mitigation and prevention. The best approach involves proactively identifying potential human rights risks associated with the proposed development project and integrating mitigation strategies into the project's design and implementation phases. This aligns with the ethical imperative to prevent harm and uphold human dignity, as enshrined in the UDR, particularly articles concerning the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to work, and the right to property. By conducting a thorough risk assessment, the state can anticipate potential negative impacts on local communities, such as displacement, environmental degradation affecting livelihoods, or labor exploitation, and develop concrete measures to avoid or minimize these. This proactive stance is supported by the general principles of responsible investment and sustainable development, which increasingly emphasize human rights due diligence. An approach that prioritizes immediate economic gains without a comprehensive human rights impact assessment is ethically and legally deficient. This failure to consider potential adverse effects on human rights, such as the right to housing or the right to health, as outlined in the UDR, could lead to significant social unrest, legal challenges, and reputational damage for Alabama. It neglects the principle of do no harm and risks violating the spirit, if not the letter, of international human rights norms that inform responsible governance. Another unacceptable approach is to assume that compliance with existing Alabama state laws is sufficient, without considering the broader international human rights context. While state laws are binding, they may not always fully encompass the protections guaranteed by international human rights standards. The UDR provides a benchmark for what constitutes fundamental human rights, and international investment agreements often implicitly or explicitly require adherence to these principles. Ignoring this broader framework risks creating projects that, while legally permissible under state law, may still result in human rights violations according to international standards. Finally, deferring human rights considerations until after a project is underway or problems arise is a reactive and inadequate strategy. This approach fails to meet the professional obligation to anticipate and prevent harm. The UDR emphasizes the inherent dignity of all persons and the importance of protecting their rights proactively. Waiting for issues to emerge means that potential harm has already occurred, making remediation more difficult and less effective, and potentially violating the rights to an adequate standard of living and freedom from discrimination. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the potential human rights implications of any development initiative. This involves conducting thorough due diligence, engaging with affected stakeholders, and integrating human rights safeguards into all stages of project planning, implementation, and monitoring. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights should serve as a guiding document for identifying these fundamental rights and ensuring they are respected and protected. Question 10. Which approach would be most effective for a new industrial development in Alabama to ensure compliance with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management's water quality standards for wastewater discharge, considering the need for sustainable development? Option A. Conduct a detailed, site-specific analysis of projected wastewater pollutant loads, e.g., BOD, TSS, and compare these against the assimilative capacity of the receiving water body, as per ADEM permitting guidelines. Option B. Defer detailed environmental impact assessments until after the facility has begun operations, prioritizing immediate project approval. Option C. Rely on qualitative descriptions of the facility's environmental management practices without quantitative load calculations. Option D. Utilize generic industry pollution estimates and assume compliance if the facility's daily wastewater volume is below a predetermined threshold. Correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed, site-specific analysis of projected wastewater pollutant loads, e.g., BOD, TSS, and compare these against the assimilative capacity of the receiving water body, as per ADEM permitting guidelines. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development goals with stringent environmental protection mandates under Alabama law, specifically concerning water quality standards for new industrial projects. The challenge lies in accurately calculating the potential impact of wastewater discharge and ensuring compliance with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM regulations, which are designed to protect public health and the environment. A precise, data-driven approach is essential to avoid costly remediation, legal penalties, and damage to the state's natural resources. The best approach involves a detailed, site-specific analysis of the proposed industrial facility's wastewater characteristics and its potential impact on the receiving water body. This includes calculating the total daily load of key pollutants, such as biochemical oxygen demand, BOD, and total suspended solids, TSS, and comparing these projected loads against the established water quality standards and the assimilative capacity of the receiving stream, as defined by a ADEM permitting process. This method ensures that the facility's discharge will not cause or contribute to a violation of water quality standards, aligning with the principles of sustainable development by allowing for economic growth without compromising environmental integrity. The calculation would involve projected BOD load equals daily production volume, x BOD concentration in effluent, x conversion factor. Projected TSS load equals daily production volume, x TSS concentration in effluent, x conversion factor. For example, if a facility plans to produce 10,000 gallons of wastewater per day, with an expected BOD concentration of 250 mg/L and TSS concentration of 300 mg/L, and assuming a conversion factor of 8.34 pounds/gallon/1000 mg/L. Projected BOD load equals 10,000 gal/day * 250 mg/L * 8.34 pounds/gal/1000 mg/L equals 2085 pounds/day. Projected TSS load equals 10,000 gal/day * 300 mg/L * 8.34 pounds/gal/1000 mg/L equals 2502 pounds/day. This calculated load must then be assessed against ADEM effluent limitations and the stream's assimilative capacity to determine permit feasibility. An approach that relies on a generic estimate of pollution based on industry averages without specific site data is professionally unacceptable. This fails to account for the unique characteristics of the proposed facility and the specific environmental conditions of the receiving water body, potentially leading to underestimation of pollution loads and subsequent noncompliance with ADEM regulations. Such an approach risks exceeding the stream's assimilative capacity, violating water quality standards, and incurring penalties. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that any discharge below a certain arbitrary volume threshold is automatically compliant. Alabama's environmental laws do not permit such blanket exemptions. Compliance is determined by the actual pollutant load and its impact, regardless of the facility's size. This method bypasses the critical step of quantitative assessment required by ADEM for all permit applications. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate project approval by deferring detailed environmental impact assessments until after construction begins is ethically and legally unsound. This violates the precautionary principle embedded in environmental law and ADEM permitting requirements, which mandate a thorough review of potential impacts before operations commence. It also creates a significant risk of requiring costly and disruptive retrofits if the initial assessments prove inadequate. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements of ADEM for industrial wastewater discharge. This involves identifying relevant water quality standards, effluent limitations, and permitting procedures. The next step is to gather accurate, site-specific data on the proposed facility's operations and wastewater characteristics. This data is then used for quantitative analysis, such as calculating pollutant loads and assessing their impact on the receiving environment. Finally, the results of this analysis are used to design mitigation measures, if necessary, and to prepare a comprehensive permit application that demonstrates compliance with all applicable Alabama environmental laws and regulations. Question 11. Investigation of the ethical considerations for an Alabama-based development agency advising a developing nation on its foreign investment law reforms. What approach best balances the host country's need for capital with the imperative to ensure investments contribute to sustainable and equitable development? Option A. Advocating for the establishment of clear, transparent, and robust legal and regulatory frameworks that attract responsible foreign investment, while simultaneously safeguarding the interests of the host developing country, including provisions for environmental protection, labor rights, and local community benefit sharing. Option B. Focusing solely on the potential financial returns of an investment without considering its broader socio-economic and environmental implications for the developing country. Option C. Prioritizing the securing of any foreign investment by relaxing environmental and labor standards to make the jurisdiction more attractive to capital. Option D. Implementing overly restrictive protectionist policies that make it excessively difficult for foreign investors to engage, thereby safeguarding national interests through exclusion. Correct answer is A. Advocating for the establishment of clear, transparent, and robust legal and regulatory frameworks that attract responsible foreign investment, while simultaneously safeguarding the interests of the host developing country, including provisions for environmental protection, labor rights, and local community benefit sharing. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a developing country's urgent need for foreign investment to foster economic growth and the ethical imperative to ensure such investments align with sustainable development goals and do not exploit local resources or labor. The pressure to secure investment can lead to compromises that might have long-term negative consequences, requiring careful judgment to balance immediate economic needs with broader societal and environmental well-being. The specific context of Alabama's International Development Law exam implies a focus on the legal and regulatory frameworks governing such investments within or impacting the state, and the ethical considerations that arise when these frameworks interact with the realities of developing economies. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves advocating for the establishment of clear, transparent, and robust legal and regulatory frameworks that attract responsible foreign investment, while simultaneously safeguarding the interests of the host developing country. This includes ensuring that investment agreements incorporate provisions for environmental protection, labor rights, and local community benefit sharing, consistent with international best practices and any applicable Alabama or federal laws governing international development initiatives. Such an approach prioritizes long-term sustainable development over short-term gains, fostering trust and ensuring that investment contributes positively to the host nation's progress. This aligns with the ethical duty of development professionals to promote equitable and sustainable outcomes. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to prioritize securing any foreign investment, regardless of its nature or potential impact, by relaxing environmental and labor standards. This fails to uphold the ethical responsibility to protect vulnerable populations and ecosystems, and can lead to exploitative practices that undermine long-term development. It also risks violating international norms and potentially contravening any specific Alabama or federal regulations designed to prevent such exploitation in international development projects. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the financial returns of an investment, without considering its broader socio-economic and environmental implications for the developing country. This narrow focus neglects the ethical obligation to ensure that development initiatives are holistic and contribute to the overall well-being of the host nation. It can lead to investments that exacerbate existing inequalities or create new environmental problems, ultimately hindering genuine development. A third incorrect approach is to adopt a purely protectionist stance, making it excessively difficult for foreign investors to engage. While safeguarding national interests is important, overly restrictive policies can stifle much-needed capital inflow, hindering economic growth and job creation. This approach fails to recognize the opportunities that well-managed foreign investment can bring and may not be aligned with the goals of international development law, which often seeks to facilitate beneficial cross-border investment. Professional reasoning. Professionals in international development law must adopt a balanced and ethically grounded approach. This involves a thorough understanding of the legal and regulatory landscape in both the host country and any relevant jurisdictions like Alabama, as well as international best practices. A critical step is conducting comprehensive due diligence on potential investors and projects to assess their alignment with sustainable development objectives. Professionals should advocate for clear contractual terms that address environmental, social, and governance-esque factors, and ensure mechanisms for accountability and dispute resolution are in place. Ethical decision-making requires prioritizing long-term, equitable development outcomes over immediate financial gains, and fostering transparency and stakeholder engagement throughout the investment process. Question 12. Assessment of a foreign direct investment proposal in Alabama's rural timber industry. A representative from the Alabama Development Office is considering whether to recommend approval. The proposal promises significant job creation and tax revenue, but involves a company with a history of environmental violations in other jurisdictions and a reputation for employing contract labor with below-standard working conditions. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible approach for the representative to recommend? Option A. Recommend approval by suggesting expedited regulatory review processes for this specific investment to facilitate job creation and tax revenue, assuming the company's international experience implies a capacity for self-regulation. Option B. Recommend approval based on the projected economic benefits, prioritizing the investor's timeline and operational flexibility, and accepting the company's assurances of future compliance with Alabama regulations. Option C. Recommend approval only after conducting thorough independent due diligence on the company's environmental compliance record and labor practices, ensuring proposed operations will strictly adhere to all Alabama environmental protection laws and fair labor standards, and verifying that the investment aligns with Alabama's long-term sustainable development goals, including community benefit. Option D. Recommend approval contingent solely on the company's commitment to creating a specified number of jobs and generating a certain level of tax revenue, without independent verification of their environmental or labor practices. The correct answer is C. Recommend approval only after conducting thorough independent due diligence on the company's environmental compliance record and labor practices, ensuring proposed operations will strictly adhere to all Alabama environmental protection laws and fair labor standards, and verifying that the investment aligns with Alabama's long-term sustainable development goals, including community benefit. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the potential economic benefits of foreign direct investment, FDI, with the ethical imperative to ensure such investment aligns with Alabama's development goals and does not exploit local resources or labor. The decision-maker must navigate complex stakeholder interests, including the foreign investor, local communities, and state economic development agencies, while adhering to Alabama's specific legal and ethical frameworks governing international investment. Careful judgment is required to avoid short-term gains that could lead to long-term social or environmental harm, or violate principles of fair dealing. The best approach involves a comprehensive due diligence process that prioritizes transparency, adherence to Alabama's environmental and labor laws, and alignment with the state's long-term sustainable development objectives. This includes thoroughly vetting the foreign investor's track record, ensuring proposed projects meet or exceed Alabama's environmental protection standards, and verifying that labor practices will comply with all state and federal regulations, including fair wages and safe working conditions. Furthermore, this approach necessitates engaging with local communities to understand their concerns and ensuring that the investment contributes positively to local infrastructure and economic diversification, rather than merely extracting resources. This aligns with the ethical duty of care and the principle of responsible investment, which are implicitly supported by Alabama's commitment to economic growth that benefits its citizens broadly and sustainably. An approach that focuses solely on maximizing immediate job creation and tax revenue, without adequately assessing environmental impact or labor rights, is professionally unacceptable. This failure to conduct thorough environmental and labor due diligence risks violating Alabama's environmental protection statutes and labor laws, potentially leading to legal penalties, reputational damage, and long-term environmental degradation. Such a narrow focus disregards the broader ethical responsibility to ensure development is sustainable and equitable. Another unacceptable approach is to prioritize the investor's proposed timeline and operational flexibility above all else, potentially leading to waivers or expedited approvals of standard regulatory processes. This undermines the integrity of Alabama's established legal and regulatory frameworks, which are designed to protect public interest and ensure responsible development. Circumventing these processes, even with the intention of attracting investment, creates a precedent for lax oversight and can lead to unintended negative consequences for the state and its residents. Finally, an approach that relies heavily on the foreign investor's self-reported compliance and assurances without independent verification is professionally deficient. This abdication of responsibility for due diligence leaves the state vulnerable to misrepresentation and noncompliance, potentially exposing Alabama to legal liabilities and ethical breaches. It fails to uphold the professional obligation to safeguard the state's interests and ensure that FDI contributes positively and ethically to Alabama's development. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining Alabama's development priorities and ethical standards. This should be followed by a rigorous, multifaceted due diligence process that includes independent verification of the investor's credentials, environmental impact assessments, labor practice reviews, and community engagement. Transparency and adherence to all applicable Alabama laws and regulations should be non-negotiable. Risk assessment and mitigation strategies should be integral to the evaluation, ensuring that potential negative impacts are identified and addressed proactively. Question 13. System analysis indicates that a developing nation in Alabama is seeking significant foreign investment for a large-scale infrastructure project that involves potential impacts on sensitive coastal wetlands. The foreign investor has presented a preliminary environmental report, but concerns have been raised by local environmental groups about its adequacy. The nation's development agency is under pressure to expedite the project to stimulate economic growth, considering the role of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, in promoting sustainable development and environmental protection. Which of the following approaches best navigates this complex situation? Option A. Initiate a limited environmental review that focuses solely on immediate localized impacts, while deferring consideration of broader ecological consequences or UNEP input to a later, unspecified stage of the project. Option B. Prioritize a comprehensive, independent environmental impact assessment (IA) that actively incorporates UNEP guidelines and seeks technical consultation from UNEP to ensure all potential ecological risks, including transboundary impacts, are thoroughly evaluated before project approval. Option C. Proceed with the project based on the investor's preliminary environmental report, focusing on expediting approvals to meet economic growth targets, with only a cursory review of potential environmental issues. Option D. Accept the investor's environmental report at face value and proceed with the project, delaying any engagement with UNEP until potential environmental issues become critical, to avoid project delays and increased costs. The correct answer is B. Prioritize a comprehensive, independent environmental impact assessment (IA) that actively incorporates UNEP guidelines and seeks technical consultation from UNEP to ensure all potential ecological risks, including transboundary impacts, are thoroughly evaluated before project approval. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a developing nation with the long-term environmental sustainability goals championed by international bodies like UNEP. The pressure to secure foreign investment for development projects can create a conflict with the precautionary principle and the need for thorough environmental impact assessments, especially when dealing with potentially sensitive ecosystems. Careful judgment is required to ensure that development is not pursued at the irreversible expense of the environment, which could have devastating consequences for future generations and the nation's long-term prosperity. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves prioritizing a comprehensive and independent environmental impact assessment (IA) that fully integrates UNEP guidelines and best practices. This approach acknowledges the critical role UNEP plays in providing frameworks and expertise for sustainable development. By actively engaging UNEP early in the process, seeking their technical assistance, and ensuring the EIA is robust, transparent, and considers potential transboundary impacts, the nation demonstrates a commitment to responsible development. This aligns with the ethical imperative to protect the environment and the regulatory expectation that development projects should not cause significant environmental harm, as often stipulated in international agreements and national environmental laws that UNEP helps to shape. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the development project based on a cursory environmental review that downplays potential risks to satisfy the investor's timeline. This fails to uphold the ethical responsibility to protect the environment and violates the spirit, if not the letter, of environmental regulations that mandate thorough assessments. It ignores the potential for long-term ecological damage, which could lead to significant economic costs in the future through disaster mitigation, loss of natural resources, and reputational damage. Another unacceptable approach is to accept the investor's self-provided environmental report without independent verification or consultation with UNEP. This approach abdicates professional responsibility and risks overlooking critical environmental concerns that a biased report might omit. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the expertise UNEP offers in assessing environmental risks, potentially leading to noncompliance with international environmental standards and national legislation. A further flawed approach is to delay or ignore UNEP recommendations due to concerns about increased project costs or timelines. While economic considerations are important, prioritizing short-term financial gains over long-term environmental sustainability is ethically unsound and professionally negligent. This approach risks significant environmental degradation, potential international criticism, and future remediation costs that could far outweigh any initial savings. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of their ethical obligations to environmental stewardship and their professional duty to ensure compliance with relevant laws and international guidelines. This involves proactively seeking and integrating expert advice, such as that provided by UNEP, throughout the project lifecycle. A structured approach would involve 1. Identifying all relevant environmental regulations and international commitments. 2. Conducting a thorough risk assessment, including potential environmental and social impacts. 3. Engaging stakeholders, including UNEP, early and transparently. 4. Evaluating development proposals against established environmental standards and sustainability principles. 5. Implementing robust monitoring and mitigation plans. This systematic process ensures that development is pursued responsibly, balancing economic needs with environmental protection. Question 14. The monitoring system demonstrates that a proposed industrial development project in Mobile County, Alabama, while meeting all current state air and water quality standards, has the potential to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions that could exacerbate climate change impacts, such as increased storm intensity and sea level rise, which may affect future coastal development and infrastructure in Alabama. As the project manager, what is the most ethically and regulatorily sound approach to address this finding? Option A. Focus solely on the immediate economic benefits of the project for Mobile County, Alabama, and defer any consideration of climate change implications to future regulatory developments or international agreements. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive climate change impact assessment. Consult with climate scientists and Alabama environmental agencies to identify mitigation and adaptation strategies, and integrate these findings into the project's design and operational plans, even if it incurs additional costs. Option C. Proceed with the project as planned, as it currently meets all established Alabama environmental regulations, and argue that climate change is a global issue beyond the scope of this specific project's immediate regulatory obligations. Option D. Request a waiver from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management for any potential future climate-related impacts, citing the project's compliance with current standards and the speculative nature of future climate change effects. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive climate change impact assessment. Consult with climate scientists and Alabama environmental agencies to identify mitigation and adaptation strategies, and integrate these findings into the project's design and operational plans, even if it incurs additional costs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate economic development goals of a project with the long-term, potentially irreversible environmental consequences of climate change, all within the specific legal and ethical framework of Alabama. The project's potential to exacerbate climate change, even indirectly, necessitates a careful consideration of Alabama's environmental regulations and its commitment to sustainable development principles. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying these frameworks when faced with conflicting interests and uncertain future impacts. The best approach involves proactively engaging with Alabama's environmental impact assessment processes and seeking expert consultation to thoroughly evaluate the project's climate change implications. This includes identifying potential greenhouse gas emissions, assessing the project's vulnerability to climate change impacts, e.g., extreme weather, sea level rise, and exploring mitigation and adaptation strategies. This approach is correct because it aligns with the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental law, which advocates for taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty regarding potential harm. Furthermore, it demonstrates a commitment to responsible development by adhering to Alabama's statutory requirements for environmental review and by prioritizing long-term sustainability over short-term gains, thereby upholding ethical obligations to future generations and the environment. An approach that prioritizes immediate economic benefits without a comprehensive assessment of climate change impacts is ethically and regulatorily flawed. This failure stems from neglecting the potential for significant environmental harm, which could lead to violations of Alabama's environmental protection statutes and undermine the state's broader development goals. Such an approach risks imposing future costs on the state and its citizens due to climate-related damages, which is contrary to the principles of sustainable development. Another unacceptable approach is to dismiss the climate change concerns as speculative or outside the scope of current Alabama regulations. While specific regulations directly addressing climate change mitigation might be evolving, the overarching principles of environmental protection and responsible resource management within Alabama law require consideration of foreseeable environmental consequences. Ignoring these implications, even if not explicitly detailed in every statute, represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the potential long-term negative externalities of development. Finally, an approach that relies solely on the minimum legal requirements without exploring best practices for climate resilience and emission reduction is insufficient. While meeting legal minimums is necessary, ethical development in the context of climate change demands a proactive and forward-thinking stance. This involves going beyond compliance to actively seek ways to minimize environmental footprint and enhance resilience, reflecting a deeper commitment to responsible stewardship. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant legal and regulatory landscape in Alabama concerning environmental protection and development. This should be followed by a comprehensive risk assessment that includes the potential impacts of climate change, both positive and negative, engaging stakeholders, seeking expert advice, and prioritizing sustainable solutions that align with both economic viability and environmental integrity are crucial steps in navigating such complex ethical and regulatory dilemmas. Question 15. The control framework reveals a proposed large-scale industrial development project in rural Alabama that is adjacent to a known habitat for the Alabama red-bellied turtle, a species listed as threatened under the Alabama Endangered Species Act. The project promises significant economic benefits, including job creation and increased tax revenue for the local community. However, preliminary environmental surveys suggest that the development's footprint may overlap with critical nesting grounds and foraging areas for this species. The development company is seeking your advice on how to proceed. What is the most ethically and legally sound approach to navigate this situation? Option A. Minimize the scope of any environmental assessments to focus only on non-sensitive areas, and proceed with construction in the potentially sensitive zones while implementing only basic, non-specific environmental controls. Option B. Proceed with the development as planned, focusing on general environmental best practices for industrial sites, and assuming that the economic benefits will outweigh any minor, unquantified impacts on the turtle population. Option C. Immediately begin lobbying state legislators to reevaluate the threatened status of the Alabama red-bellied turtle, arguing that its current listing hinders economic progress in the region. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact statement, EIS, that specifically addresses the potential impacts on the Alabama red-bellied turtle. Consult with the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop robust mitigation and conservation plans and explore alternative site designs or operational adjustments to minimize habitat disruption. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact statement (EIS) that specifically addresses the potential impacts on the Alabama red-bellied turtle. Consult with the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop robust mitigation and conservation plans and explore alternative site designs or operational adjustments to minimize habitat disruption. Explanation: the control framework reveals a complex scenario where economic development interests clash with the imperative to protect Alabama's unique biodiversity, particularly in the context of the Endangered Species Act and Alabama's own conservation statutes. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires balancing competing legal obligations, ethical considerations, and the potential for significant economic impact. A careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests without violating legal mandates or ethical principles. The best professional approach involves prioritizing adherence to the Alabama Endangered Species Act and Federal Endangered Species Act requirements. This means conducting thorough environmental impact assessments, consulting with relevant state and federal wildlife agencies, such as the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and actively seeking mitigation strategies that minimize harm to protected species and their habitats. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal obligations to protect endangered and threatened species, which are paramount under both state and federal law. Ethical considerations also support this approach, as it demonstrates a commitment to environmental stewardship and the long-term sustainability of Alabama's natural heritage. An approach that prioritizes immediate economic gains by downplaying or ignoring potential impacts on protected species is ethically and legally unacceptable. This failure stems from a direct violation of the Alabama Endangered Species Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act, which mandate protective measures for listed species. Such an approach would also likely involve a failure to consult with regulatory agencies, a breach of professional responsibility, and could lead to significant legal penalties, project delays, and reputational damage. Another unacceptable approach is to rely solely on general environmental best practices without specifically addressing the requirements for endangered species. While general best practices are important, they are insufficient when specific legal protections for listed species are in place. This approach fails to meet the heightened legal standards required by the Alabama Endangered Species Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act, potentially leading to unintended harm to protected populations and noncompliance with the law. Finally, an approach that seeks to lobby for exemptions or weaker enforcement of conservation laws without a genuine commitment to finding viable mitigation or conservation alternatives is also professionally unsound. While advocacy is a part of the development process, it must be grounded in a good faith effort to comply with existing legal frameworks and to find solutions that balance development with conservation. A purely adversarial stance that seeks to undermine established environmental protections without proposing constructive alternatives is ethically questionable and legally risky. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable federal and state laws, including the Alabama Endangered Species Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of potential impacts on biodiversity. Engagement with regulatory agencies and stakeholders should be proactive and transparent. The development of mitigation and conservation plans should be a core component of the project, aiming for solutions that are both legally compliant and ethically responsible, ensuring the long-term health of Alabama's natural resources. Question 16. The control framework reveals a proposed industrial development project in rural Alabama that promises significant economic benefits and job creation. However, preliminary environmental assessments suggest potential impacts on local water quality and biodiversity, raising concerns about alignment with Alabama's environmental protection laws and the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG. Which of the following approaches best navigates this ethical and regulatory challenge? Option A. Implement minimal environmental mitigation measures based on general industry best practices, without a detailed impact assessment or specific consideration of Alabama's environmental statutes or SDG alignment. Option B. Rely on the project developer's assurances of environmental responsibility and commitment to sustainability, without independent verification or a formal assessment against state regulations and SDG targets. Option C. Prioritize the economic benefits and job creation, proceeding with the project and addressing any environmental concerns that arise only if they become legally mandated or demonstrably severe. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that explicitly addresses potential effects on water quality and biodiversity, ensuring full compliance with Alabama Department of Environmental Management (ADEM) regulations and evaluating alignment with relevant SDGs, particularly those concerning environmental protection and climate action. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that explicitly addresses potential effects on water quality and biodiversity, ensuring full compliance with Alabama Department of Environmental Management (ADEM) regulations and evaluating alignment with relevant SDGs, particularly those concerning environmental protection and climate action. Explanation. The control framework reveals a common ethical dilemma faced by international development professionals in Alabama, balancing economic development with environmental stewardship, particularly concerning the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between economic incentives for local businesses, potential environmental degradation, and Alabama's specific environmental regulations, and the broader ethical commitments to global sustainability. Careful judgment is required to ensure that development projects do not inadvertently undermine long-term environmental health or violate established legal and ethical standards. The best approach involves prioritizing a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that explicitly considers the alignment with relevant SDGs, particularly SDG 13, Climate Action, and SDG 15, Life on Land, and adheres strictly to Alabama's environmental protection laws. This approach is correct because it proactively identifies potential environmental risks and mitigation strategies before project commencement. By integrating SDG considerations into the assessment, it ensures that the project contributes positively to global sustainability objectives while remaining compliant with state-level environmental regulations, such as those enforced by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management (ADEM). This demonstrates a commitment to responsible development that respects both local legal frameworks and international environmental commitments. An approach that focuses solely on immediate economic benefits without a thorough environmental review is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for Alabama's environmental laws, which mandate such assessments for projects with potential environmental impacts. Ethically, it violates the principle of intergenerational equity and the spirit of the SDGs, which aim for sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Another unacceptable approach is to implement mitigation measures only after environmental damage has occurred. This reactive strategy is flawed because it often leads to more costly remediation, potential legal penalties under Alabama law, and irreversible environmental harm. It fails to uphold the precautionary principle, which suggests taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty about potential environmental harm. Finally, an approach that relies on vague assurances of environmental responsibility from project developers without independent verification or adherence to specific regulatory requirements is also professionally unsound. This lacks the rigor necessary to ensure compliance with Alabama's environmental statutes and the ethical imperative to protect natural resources. It creates a significant risk of non-compliance and reputational damage. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant legal landscape in Alabama, including ADEM regulations and any specific state environmental policies. This should be followed by a robust assessment of potential environmental impacts, explicitly linking these to relevant SDGs. Stakeholder engagement, transparency, and a commitment to implementing best practices for environmental protection and mitigation are crucial throughout the project lifecycle. Question 17. The control framework reveals that an Alabama-based international development firm, contracted by the U.S. government to manage a project in a developing nation, is now involved in an investor-state dispute settlement, ISTS, proceeding under a bilateral investment treaty between the U.S. and that nation. The firm has discovered that the lead counsel representing the host state in the ISTS proceeding previously worked closely with a senior partner at the firm on unrelated matters for several years. What is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible course of action for the Alabama firm to take? Option A. Immediately disclose the prior professional relationship to the U.S. government, the host state's designated authority, and the ISTS tribunal, and request guidance on how to proceed, potentially including the appointment of an independent arbitrator. Option B. Withdraw the firm from its role in the ISTS proceedings without further explanation to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Option C. Continue with the ISTS proceedings as planned, assuming the prior relationship does not constitute a direct conflict of interest, and address any concerns if they arise during the process. Option D. Attempt to leverage the prior relationship with the host state's counsel to negotiate a more favorable outcome for the investor in the ISTS proceeding. The correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the prior professional relationship to the U.S. government, the host state's designated authority, and the ISTS tribunal, and request guidance on how to proceed, potentially including the appointment of an independent arbitrator. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex ethical dilemma for an Alabama-based international development firm involved in a project funded by the U.S. government and operating under an investment treaty with a foreign nation. The scenario presents a conflict between the firm's contractual obligations, the principles of investor-state dispute settlement ISTS, and the potential for perceived bias. The professionally challenging aspect of this scenario lies in navigating the delicate balance between upholding the firm's contractual rights and obligations under the investment treaty, maintaining its reputation for impartiality, and adhering to ethical standards in international development. Firm must consider the implications of its actions on its relationship with both the host state and the funding agency, as well as the broader principles of fair dispute resolution. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could be construed as a conflict of interest or that might undermine the integrity of the ISTS process. The best professional approach involves transparently disclosing the potential conflict of interest to all relevant parties, including the U.S. government and the host state's designated authority. This approach prioritizes open communication and adherence to ethical guidelines that govern international development and dispute resolution. By proactively informing stakeholders, the firm demonstrates its commitment to integrity and allows for informed decision-making regarding the firm's continued involvement or the appointment of an independent arbitrator. This aligns with the ethical imperative to avoid even the appearance of impropriety and ensures that the ISTS process, as envisioned by the investment treaty, can proceed with fairness and impartiality. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the arbitration without disclosing the prior professional relationship with the host state's legal counsel. This failure to disclose creates a significant ethical breach, as it conceals information that could reasonably lead to a perception of bias. The ISTS framework, while designed to provide a neutral forum, relies heavily on the integrity and transparency of the arbitrators and involved parties. Concealing such a relationship undermines the fundamental principle of impartiality and could lead to the arbitration award being challenged on grounds of procedural unfairness, potentially violating the due process rights of the investor. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally withdraw from the arbitration proceedings without proper consultation or notification. While seemingly avoiding a conflict, this action could be interpreted as an admission of guilt or an attempt to evade responsibility, potentially jeopardizing the investor's rights and creating further complications for the U.S. government's funding. It also fails to address the underlying issue of the potential conflict and does not facilitate a fair resolution of the dispute. A final incorrect approach would be to attempt to influence the selection of the arbitrator in a way that favors the firm's position, leveraging the prior relationship with the host state's counsel. This is a clear violation of ethical principles and the spirit of ISTS, which mandates neutral and independent arbitrators. Such an action would not only be unethical, but could also lead to severe legal repercussions and reputational damage, completely compromising the integrity of the dispute resolution process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This should be followed by a thorough review of relevant ethical codes and contractual obligations, such as those governing ISTS under the specific investment treaty. Transparency and open communication with all stakeholders are paramount. When a conflict is identified, seeking guidance from legal counsel and senior management is crucial to determine the most appropriate course of action, which often involves disclosure and potentially recusal or the appointment of an independent third party. Question 18. The control framework reveals that an Alabama-based international development firm operating under a bilateral investment treaty, BIT, between the United States and a developing nation has identified a significant investment opportunity. This opportunity promises substantial returns for the firm's investors, but raises concerns about its alignment with the BIT's core principles of fair and equitable treatment and its potential impact on the host nation's long-term sustainable development goals. The firm's leadership is divided on how to proceed, with some advocating for immediate pursuit of the opportunity due to its profitability, while others express caution regarding potential treaty violations and ethical implications. What is the most responsible course of action for the firm to take in this situation? Option A. Pursue the investment opportunity by prioritizing the firm's financial interests and seeking to interpret the BIT's provisions in the most favorable light for maximizing immediate returns. Option B. Decline the investment opportunity outright due to the perceived ambiguity and potential for conflict, without further consultation or exploration of alternative structuring. Option C. Proactively disclose the potential conflict of interest and the concerns regarding BIT alignment to both the U.S. government and the host nation's government, and engage in a collaborative assessment of the opportunity's compliance and mutual benefit before proceeding. Option D. Proceed with the investment opportunity immediately, relying on the firm's interpretation of the BIT's provisions to justify its actions and inform investors of the potential benefits. The correct answer is C. Proactively disclose the potential conflict of interest and the concerns regarding BIT alignment to both the U.S. government and the host nation's government, and engage in a collaborative assessment of the opportunity's compliance and mutual benefit before proceeding. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex ethical dilemma for an Alabama-based international development firm involved in a project funded by a bilateral investment treaty, BIT, between the United States and a developing nation. The challenge lies in balancing the firm's fiduciary duty to its investors with the treaty's objectives and the host country's development needs, particularly when faced with a potential opportunity that could significantly benefit the firm, but might not align perfectly with the BIT's spirit or the host nation's long-term sustainable development goals. The firm must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure transparency and adherence to the treaty's provisions, which are designed to promote mutual investment and economic cooperation. The best professional approach involves prioritizing transparency and seeking explicit clarification from all stakeholders. This means proactively disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the U.S. government as the treaty signatory and the host nation's government, and to the firm's investors. The firm should then engage in a collaborative discussion to assess the proposed opportunity's alignment with the BIT's objectives, which typically include fair and equitable treatment, protection against expropriation, and dispute resolution mechanisms, all aimed at fostering a stable investment climate. This approach upholds the ethical principles of honesty, integrity, and accountability, ensuring that the firm acts in a manner consistent with the spirit and letter of the BIT and its own governance standards. An approach that involves proceeding with the opportunity without full disclosure and consultation is professionally unacceptable. This failure to be transparent with the U.S. government and the host nation could be construed as a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the BIT, which relies on mutual trust and adherence to agreed-upon principles. Such an action would also breach the firm's fiduciary duty to its investors by potentially exposing them to reputational damage and legal challenges, and it disregards the ethical obligation to act in a manner that genuinely supports the host country's development as intended by the treaty. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to unilaterally decide that the opportunity, while profitable, does not align with the BIT and to abandon it without consultation. While caution is warranted, this approach fails to explore potential avenues for structuring the opportunity in a way that could be mutually beneficial and compliant with the BIT. It misses an opportunity for constructive dialogue and problem-solving, potentially hindering investment flows that the BIT aims to facilitate. This decision, made in isolation, does not demonstrate due diligence in exploring all compliant avenues for investment. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on maximizing short-term financial gains for the firm, even if it means bending the interpretation of the BIT's provisions, is ethically and professionally flawed. BITs are designed to create a predictable and stable environment for long-term investment, not to be exploited for immediate profit at the expense of treaty principles or the host country's interests. This approach risks undermining the very foundation of international investment law and could lead to significant legal repercussions and reputational damage. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest and ethical considerations. This involves a thorough understanding of the relevant legal framework, in this case, the specific BIT between the U.S. and the host nation, and the firm's own internal policies and fiduciary duties. The next step is to engage in open and honest communication with all relevant parties, seeking clarification and consensus. This collaborative approach ensures that decisions are informed, transparent, and aligned with both legal obligations and ethical principles, fostering sustainable and mutually beneficial outcomes. Question 19. The control framework reveals that an Alabama-based international development firm, engaged in a significant infrastructure project in a developing nation, is facing pressure from its powerful local partner to expedite environmental approvals by minimizing the scope of the Environmental Impact Assessment IA and overlooking certain potential ecological disruptions. The firm's investors are keen on timely returns, but the firm's internal ethics committee has raised concerns about potential long-term environmental liabilities and reputational damage. What is the most ethically and regulatorily sound course of action for the Alabama firm? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive EIA that fully adheres to international best practices and relevant host country regulations, proactively engage with international environmental bodies, and transparently communicate potential risks and mitigation strategies to investors. Option B. Expedite project approvals by accepting the local partner's assurances regarding environmental compliance and focusing primarily on meeting investor expectations for rapid project completion. Option C. Explore options to influence the host country's environmental regulatory bodies to expedite approvals, prioritizing project timelines over a potentially lengthy and costly EIA process. Option D. Delegate the responsibility for environmental oversight entirely to the local partner, trusting their expertise and local connections to manage environmental concerns. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive EIA that fully adheres to international best practices and relevant host country regulations, proactively engage with international environmental bodies, and transparently communicate potential risks and mitigation strategies to investors. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex ethical dilemma for an Alabama-based international development firm involved in a significant infrastructure project in a developing nation. The challenge lies in balancing the firm's fiduciary duty to its investors with the ethical imperative to uphold international standards of environmental protection and local community welfare, especially when faced with pressure from a powerful local partner. The scenario demands careful judgment to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with both Alabama corporate law and international investment principles. The best approach involves prioritizing transparency and adherence to established international environmental and social governance standards, even if it incurs short-term costs or delays. This means proactively engaging with the host country's regulatory bodies and international environmental organizations to ensure the project's Environmental Impact Assessment IA is robust and addresses all potential concerns. Furthermore, it requires open communication with the firm's investors about the potential risks and mitigation strategies related to environmental and social issues, framing these as long-term value preservation rather than mere compliance burdens. This approach aligns with the principles of responsible investment and corporate social responsibility, which are increasingly expected of international development firms operating under Alabama's corporate governance framework, aiming to protect the firm's reputation and long-term sustainability, an approach that prioritizes immediate project completion and profit maximization by downplaying environmental concerns and circumventing rigorous assessment processes is ethically and regulatorily unsound. This would likely violate international investment agreements that often include provisions for environmental protection and could expose the firm to significant legal challenges, reputational damage, and investor backlash. It also fails to acknowledge the potential for long-term environmental and social costs that could ultimately harm the project's viability and the firm's standing. Another unacceptable approach would be to solely rely on the local partner's assurances regarding environmental compliance without independent verification. While local knowledge is valuable, the Alabama firm retains ultimate responsibility for the project's adherence to international standards. Delegating this responsibility entirely to a partner with potentially different priorities creates a significant compliance gap and a failure of due diligence. This could lead to unforeseen environmental damage, community opposition, and legal liabilities, undermining the project's objectives and the firm's ethical obligations. Finally, an approach that involves seeking to influence local regulatory bodies through means that could be perceived as undue influence or bribery, even if not explicitly illegal under local law, is ethically problematic and could violate international anti-corruption conventions and Alabama's corporate ethics guidelines. Such actions erode trust, create long-term risks, and are inconsistent with the principles of fair and transparent international development. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable laws and ethical codes, both domestic, Alabama, and international. This involves conducting comprehensive risk assessments, including environmental and social impact assessments, and seeking expert advice. Open and honest communication with all stakeholders, including investors, host country authorities, and local communities, is paramount. Prioritizing long-term sustainability and ethical conduct over short-term gains is crucial for building trust and ensuring the success of international development projects. Question 20. What factors determine the ethical and financial viability of an Alabama-based international development firm's proposed project in a developing nation that is a WTO member, specifically concerning the World Trade Organization's role in fostering equitable development and technology transfer? Option A. Focusing exclusively on securing robust intellectual property rights for the firm's technologies without considering the implications for local capacity building or technology diffusion. Option B. A comprehensive assessment of the project's alignment with WTO principles on intellectual property rights and technology transfer, coupled with a discounted cash flow analysis that incorporates a risk premium reflecting the developmental context and potential WTO compliance challenges. Option C. Prioritizing immediate profit maximization based on a high nominal return on investment, assuming that any profitable venture inherently contributes to development. Option D. Conducting a superficial market analysis that overlooks potential trade barriers and disputes, assuming that WTO membership automatically guarantees a favorable business environment. The correct answer is B. A comprehensive assessment of the project's alignment with WTO principles on intellectual property rights and technology transfer, coupled with a discounted cash flow analysis that incorporates a risk premium reflecting the developmental context and potential WTO compliance challenges. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama-based international development firm considering a project in a developing nation that is a WTO member. The challenge lies in balancing the firm's profit motive with the WTO's developmental objectives and the ethical imperative to ensure fair trade practices and sustainable development. Misinterpreting or ignoring the WTO's role in development can lead to projects that are not only financially unsustainable, but also ethically questionable, potentially exploiting developing economies or undermining fair competition, which are key tenets of international trade law as interpreted by the WTO. Careful judgment is required to align project goals with both economic viability and the broader developmental mandate of the WTO. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive assessment of how the proposed project aligns with the WTO's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, and its provisions aimed at facilitating technology transfer to developing countries. This includes analyzing the potential for the project to contribute to local capacity building, the transfer of appropriate technologies, and the creation of sustainable economic opportunities that do not rely on unfair trade practices or intellectual property exploitation. Specifically, the firm should calculate the projected return on investment (ROI) using a discounted cash flow (DCF) model that incorporates a risk premium reflecting the specific developmental context and potential WTO compliance challenges. The formula for DCF is \DCF equals \sum t equals 1n \frac CFT 1 plus RT where CFT is the cash flow in year \T R is the discount rate reflecting risk and opportunity cost, and \N is the number of periods. A higher risk premium reflecting potential WTO compliance issues or developmental hurdles would lead to a lower present value, thus providing a more conservative and ethically sound investment decision. This approach directly addresses the WTO's developmental role by ensuring that the project's economic benefits are sustainable and contribute positively to the host country's development without violating international trade principles. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing immediate profit maximization by assuming that any project generating a high nominal ROI is inherently beneficial, without adequately considering the WTO's developmental objectives or the host country's specific needs. This approach fails to account for the potential for unsustainable economic practices, intellectual property disputes, or the creation of dependencies that contradict the spirit of fair and equitable development promoted by the WTO. Ethically, this can be seen as exploitative. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on securing intellectual property rights without considering the implications for technology transfer and local capacity building. While IP protection is a WTO principle, the TRIPS agreement also includes provisions for developing countries to access and utilize technology. Ignoring these aspects can lead to projects that stifle local innovation and economic growth, which is contrary to the WTO's developmental mandate. This approach risks creating a situation where the firm benefits at the expense of the host country's long-term development. A further incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial market analysis that overlooks potential trade barriers or disputes that could arise under WTO rules. This might involve underestimating the impact of local regulations that are designed to foster domestic industries or protect nascent sectors, which are often permissible under WTO agreements. Failing to conduct a thorough analysis of the regulatory landscape and potential trade disputes can lead to significant financial losses and reputational damage, and it disregards the WTO's role in ensuring a predictable and rules-based international trading system. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that integrates ethical considerations and regulatory compliance with financial analysis. This involves 1. Understanding the specific context of the host country and its commitments under WTO agreements. 2. Conducting a thorough due diligence that includes financial projections, risk assessments, and an evaluation of the project's alignment with WTO developmental objectives. 3. Utilizing financial modeling that incorporates appropriate risk premiums and discount rates reflecting the developmental context. 4. Seeking expert advice on international trade law and local regulations. 5. Prioritizing projects that offer mutual benefit and contribute to sustainable development, rather than solely focusing on short-term gains.